Two men have been sentenced to life for the 2024 murder of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. Tameisha Price was just about 1 month away from her due date for her daughter Malaysia when she was shot and killed in her home. Megan Hartnett joins us in studio. Megan, did either of the men who killed her speak at court today?
Kaylee, neither said anything. Both Paris James and Jerry Scott were found guilty earlier this month of 13 different charges, including aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and felonious assault. The defense asked the judge for opportunities for redemption, something he decided not to give. Paris James and Jerry Scott have been sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, followed by 18 to 23 years.
This is the worst form of violence that could possibly occur.
James's defense attorney asked Judge Eric Allen Marks to consider a possibility for a second chance, asking for a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years.
In this sentencing, we're not asking for leniency, but we are asking the court to consider the possibility of redemption. Mr. James comes before this court as a young man with a limited criminal history.
And Scott's did the same, saying this is a tragic case, leaving a family not having 2 loved ones, something that Scott's family will now experience.
Now Mr. Scott's family is going to feel the same penalty as they're going to lose Mr. Scott in their life for a period of time.
But Judge Marks spoke of the harm brought to the family that no longer has Tameisha Price and her unborn daughter, Malaysia Liani. A victim advocate read letters from Price's parents who wrote about her excitement to have a baby girl.
She talked about Malaysia and that she would probably play sports because she was very active. She talked about Malaysia playing with her brothers and how they would spoil their baby sister. She talked about having to plan sleepovers, Girl Scout, family trips to Hawaii, and so many things concerning Malaysia.
Price also leaves behind 2 sons, and her parents say they are taking care of them.
We will spend the rest of our lives making sure they are rebuilt and restored from the terrible memories these people have created.
Both James and Scott had to sign forms enrolling as violent offenders. Both defense attorneys asked for Judge Marks to appoint counsel for appeals, which must be filed in 30 days. Kaylee?
Megan, James and Scott aren't the only 2 people facing charges in relation to this case. Where do things stand with the third suspect?
The third suspect, Shatwaya Triplett, was indicted in March on 2 felony counts of obstructing justice. She's scheduled to be in court for trial on August 19th. Reporting in studio, Megan Hartnett, WTOL 11.
A mother's cry pierced the stillness of a Toledo courtroom. Her words weren't just grief. They were questions no parent should ever have to ask. She spoke of a daughter who would never laugh, never run, never call her mom again. She spoke of a granddaughter whose heartbeat had already filled the family with hope, only for it to be silenced before she ever saw the world. On a cold January night, in the quiet of a South Toledo street, life was stolen in a way that even seasoned detectives struggled to process. The house where dreams of a newborn once filled the air was reduced to a crime scene marked with blood and sorrow. This wasn't random. Someone came there with a purpose. Someone made sure she would never hold her child. And that's where the mystery begins. Why would anyone target a young mother just weeks away from giving birth? Why did her fight to keep her baby alive end in her own death? Tonight, we unravel a case that left a city in shock, a family in ruins, and a question hanging in the air. Who wanted her gone and why?
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
January 24th, 2024. A quiet evening in South Toledo turned into a nightmare. Inside a modest home on Norton Place, near the busy intersection of Airport Highway and Reynolds Road, gunfire shattered the silence. When police arrived, they discovered 34-year-old Tameisha Price, struck by multiple bullets. The Lucas County coroner later confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Her death was a homicide. At the time, she was just weeks away from giving birth. Her unborn daughter, Malaysia, died with her. For investigators, this was not just a murder. It was the destruction of 2 lives at once. Toledo is no stranger to tragedy, but this case struck at the very heart of the community. A mother already raising 2 sons, preparing to welcome a daughter, murdered in the very space that should have been her sanctuary. Neighbors, already wary of crime creeping through the city, were left shaken. This was not a street corner dispute or a robbery gone wrong. This was an attack inside a woman's home, targeted and deliberate. Why would someone choose to end her life, and that of the child she carried, so close to the moment of birth? Was this a crime born of rage, of fear, of jealousy? Or was there something even more calculated behind it? Those questions would drive the investigation forward. But to understand the meaning of this loss and the depth of this crime, we must first understand who Tameisha was, not just as a victim, but as a woman, a mother, and a daughter who mattered. Before headlines and courtroom testimonies, there was simply a woman named Tameisha. Born and raised in Toledo, she grew up surrounded by family, faith, and the bonds of community that shaped her spirit. Friends remember a girl who laughed easily, who was quick to help, and who carried a confidence that drew others near. She was not defined by perfection, but by perseverance. Life had tested her early. Relationships that did not last, responsibilities that weighed heavy, and moments where she had to fight harder than most. But even in struggle, she carried herself with pride. To those who knew her, she was both tender and resilient, the kind of woman who could hold her children close in one moment and face the world with strength in the next. Her two sons were her foundation. Every school project, every sports game, every bedtime story, she poured herself into them. Family photos show her smile wide as her boys leaned into her embrace, their small hands reaching for the woman who never let them go without love. She often spoke of wanting to give them a life she never had, to shield them from disappointments she had endured. In her circle of friends, she was known for her warmth. She had a way of making others feel seen, of reminding people that they mattered. One cousin recalled how she never left a gathering without hugging everyone goodbye. Another remembered her as the kind of friend who would check in late at night, just to say, "I love you, don't forget that." And when she learned she was expecting a baby girl, her joy spilled out for everyone to see. Malaysia was more than a pregnancy. She was a promise of new beginnings. The nursery plans, the tiny clothes folded neatly, the baby shower filled with laughter, it all carried a sense of anticipation. Tameisha was ready to bring her daughter into a world she had fought so hard to shape. She was not just another name on a police report. She was a mother with dreams, a daughter with a family who adored her, and a woman whose life was interwoven with countless others. The weight of her loss could not be measured only in grief. It was felt in every life she touched. And yet, behind the moments of love and joy, there were tensions that few could see. Tensions that would lead her story into darker chapters, where devotion collided with betrayal and hope was met with violence. In every story of tragedy, there are people whose presence alters the path of the victim's life. For Tameisha, that turning point came in the form of a man named Paris James. At 37 years old, Paris was older than her by only a few years, but the difference in their outlooks was wider than it seemed. To the outside world, he carried himself with confidence, tall, broad, a man whose demeanor spoke of authority. To those closer, there were contradictions, charm on some days, distance on others, and a restlessness that never seemed to quiet down. He was not her first love. Tameisha had lived through failed relationships before, men who left, men who disappointed, men who did not share her vision of building a family. By the time Paris entered her world, she was weary but hopeful. Friends recall her saying she believed he might be different. He came with the promise of stability, a man who seemed to understand her struggles as a single mother, and someone who, at least in the beginning, gave her the attention she had longed for. But beneath the surface of their relationship were unspoken truths. Text messages later uncovered in court painted a picture that contradicted the smiles and conversations they shared. Paris expressed doubts about whether the baby she carried was his, pressuring her with cruel suggestions about abortion. Yet in the same breath, he would offer reassurances that he would stand by her. It was a cycle that left her torn, fighting to hold on to her joy while facing a storm she could not control. Into this complicated relationship came another figure, Jerry Scott, 28 years old, younger but deeply connected to Paris. Unlike Paris, Jerry had no history with Tameisha herself. His ties were through loyalty to his friend, loyalty that would eventually bind him to an act of unspeakable violence. He was described as impressionable, a man who followed rather than led, but someone willing to step into darkness if it meant earning trust. To the community, the connection between Paris and Jerry was invisible. They were not household names, not figures who stood out in Tameisha's daily life. But behind closed doors, plans were taking shape. Plans that revealed themselves only later, in the cold analysis of investigators piecing together digital footprints. Still, in those final months of her life, Tameisha held on to the brighter side of her world. She shared photos of her growing belly, leaned on her parents for support, and envisioned her sons holding their baby sister for the first time. Whatever doubts or conflicts arose with Paris, she was determined to see this pregnancy through. She was 8 months along. There was no turning back. This child was her future. But for Paris, the child represented a question he could not resolve, a truth he was unwilling to accept. And in the shadows of that conflict, his choices would draw Jerry Scott into a night that ended with bloodshed. The morning of January 24th, 2024, began like so many others in the Price household. Winter sunlight crept slowly through the curtains, glinting off the frost that clung to cars parked along Norton Place. Inside, Tameisha moved with the calm rhythm of routine, her belly heavy with the weight of her daughter nearly ready to be born. She had just returned from a doctor's appointment earlier in the week, one of those visits where the anticipation of hearing the baby's heartbeat felt like a small celebration. Everything was progressing well. At 38 weeks, she knew it could be any day. Her hospital bag sat by the door, neatly packed with baby clothes, diapers, and the tiny pink blanket she had chosen from Malaysia. By late morning, she was texting back and forth with friends and family. One message to her cousin was lighthearted, joking about how restless the baby seemed that morning. Another text to her mother carried a softer tone, promising she would stop by later that week with the boys once the weather cleared. Around lunchtime, neighbors saw her outside briefly, letting one of her sons run ahead toward the corner store. She called after him with a laugh, holding her coat close against the cold, then returned quickly inside. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary day, full of the familiar tasks of motherhood. But beneath the ordinary was a tension she did not voice. Phone records later revealed that she had spoken to Paris that afternoon. What was said between them? Only fragments remain. But investigators found enough to suggest conflict. A man pressing for decisions she would not make, and a woman resolute in her refusal to end a life that was already so close to beginning. As evening fell, the streets of South Toledo grew quieter. Streetlights flickered on, casting pale halos across sidewalks damp with melted snow. Inside her home, Tameisha settled her sons for the night. They played video games in the living room, their laughter carrying down the hall, while she folded baby clothes in the bedroom, pausing every so often to press a hand against her stomach when the baby shifted inside her. Shortly after 8 p.m., she placed a call to a close friend. They spoke about the upcoming baby shower her family still wanted to hold, even though Malaysia could arrive any day now. She sounded tired but happy. There was no hint that this would be the last time her voice would be heard. By 9 p.m., her phone grew quiet. Calls from her mother later that night went unanswered. Texts that would normally receive a reply within minutes remained unopened. For her family, it was unusual but not immediately alarming. They assumed she had gone to bed early, exhausted as she often was in the final stretch of pregnancy. What no one knew was that outside her home, shadows were already moving. A plan that had been set in motion was drawing near its final steps. Two men, bound by loyalty and dark resolve, were closing in on a house where a mother believed she and her children were safe. The final hours of Tameisha Price's life ticked away unnoticed, each minute carrying her closer to an act of violence that would devastate not only her family, but an entire community. The first call for help reached dispatch in the evening, a frightened voice reporting sharp cracks that didn't sound like fireworks, then silence. Patrol units rolled toward Norton Place, tires whispering over wet pavement, street lamps turning the road into a corridor of pale cones. Neighbors had stepped onto porches in slippers and coats, arms folded tight against the air. They pointed, not speaking, toward the small house where the lights inside no longer moved. Officers approached the doorway with practiced caution. A faint metallic smell rode the heat from inside. The threshold told its own story. A rug turned at an angle, particles of drywall dust scattered where something had struck and splintered. Entry was swift, controlled. Commands were announced into rooms that did not answer. What they found stopped the momentum of the search. A woman, very near to delivering a child, unmoving. The room around her carried the ordinary fingerprints of family life. Laundry folded in a neat stack, a pair of children's sneakers kicked beneath a chair, a phone charger draped from an outlet like a loose ribbon. The contrast was brutal. Violence had crossed a line meant to be untouchable. Medics were brought to the scene immediately. Vitals were assessed with urgency and dread, movements efficient and spare. There's a choreography to emergency care, a sequence that can fill a room with ordered motion. Here, it narrowed quickly to the stillness that follows medical certainty. One life already taken, another that never had a chance to begin. The house became a boundary. Yellow tape stretched from porch post to fence picket as officers established a perimeter. Radios crackled with assignments. A sergeant began a scene log at the curb, noting each person who entered, each step now accountable. The evidence technician arrived with a hard-sided case, then another. Photographs began, wide first, then mid-range, then close. The lens swept doorways, baseboards, tabletops, a context for every small detail. Numbered tints appeared near minute flecks on the floor, near tiny crescents and faint arcs, near places where a bullet had found something solid and left a mark. Detectives walked the space with measured steps, eyes scanning for patterns that only training teaches you to see. Interrupted dust, fresh scuffs at waist height, a mark on a latch, a fiber caught where it did not belong. They paused at a packed hospital bag near the front, the zipper drawn to the corner as if it had been tested and found ready. A tiny onesie folded atop pastel blankets inside the tote spoke more loudly than any voice on scene. Canvassing began house by house. A team knocked gently, not to startle children who had been put to bed early, not to frighten elders who were already awake with worry. Who heard what and when? Which direction did the sound seem to travel? Did anyone see a vehicle cruise past twice? Did a porch camera blink at an odd hour? An older neighbor squinted at her memory, then nodded. There had been a car she didn't recognize idling by the corner before the streetlights came on. Another neighbor, hands trembling, remembered a hurried silhouette moving away from the house with a hood pulled tight. Nothing definitive yet, but the fragments began to map. Body-worn cameras captured the quiet aftermath. The shallow reflections of light on kitchen tile, the reverent way evidence markers were set down, the sound of boots creaking over floorboards that would be dusted and swabbed. In the hallway, an officer paused at a wall where a height chart in pencil recorded birthdays in growth spurts. Names and dates rose in uneven intervals, 2 boys measured in inches and hope. That simple vertical story, innocent and earnest, framed the cruelty of what had just been done. The ballistic work started in parallel. Trajectory strings were anchored where strikes had been identified, lines stretching across the air to illustrate angles no longer visible to the untrained eye. A detective noted entry and possible exit points, then traced back to where a shooter might have stood, how they might have moved between shots, whether they had taken a step closer or angled away. On a clipboard, the room became geometry, distances, heights, calculated possibilities. Nearby, a casing was lifted into a pouch, the small click of plastic sealing punctuating the note written on its label. Outside, cruisers idled softly while the street settled into the hush that follows catastrophe. The tape fluttered at the corners in the breeze, and beyond it a small knot of family and neighbors gathered, faces drawn, voices low. A woman pressed a tissue to her mouth and stared at the front door as if willing it to open and restore what had been stolen. Officers positioned themselves between the grief and the threshold, protecting the sanctity of what was now a crime scene and, in another sense, a memorial. The coroner's team arrived with somber precision. Documentation proceeded step by step. Photographs concluded, measurements finalized, each item located, tagged, and entered into a chain that would follow it to the lab. The victim was prepared for transport with care and dignity, every action acknowledging not only a case number, but a life with a name, a family, a future that had been planned down to the color of a blanket and the first outfit a newborn would wear home. Detectives stepped back into the cold air and compared notes. Phone extractions would be urgent. Geofencing warrants would be drafted. Nearby businesses along Airport Highway and Reynolds Road would be contacted at opening. Their surveillance systems might hold pixels of truth, a headlight pattern, a partial plate, the indistinct shape of someone who believed night would hide them. Doorbell cameras on adjacent blocks would be cataloged and, if permitted, pulled. The map on the supervisor's tablet filled with pins that represented a grid of questions to be resolved before dawn. By the time the scene was released, the house held a silence that felt heavy and permanent, a silence that would greet family with the knowledge that nothing inside would ever be just ordinary again. The tape came down. The porch light clicked off. The street returned to its dim, uneasy calm. But the investigation did not sleep. While evidence dried in paper bags at the lab and latent prints cured under heat, detectives moved to the next phase, turning data into direction into suspects, and suspects into answers. Cell phones, they knew, are often faithful witnesses. They remember what people prefer to forget. They place you in locations your words later deny. They record the silent choreography of two men traveling across a city with purpose and then attempting to shed that purpose in water and weeds. The road from this house would lead outward to another part of Toledo, to a marshland where the wind moves through tall grass and paw prints crisscross soft earth. There, a metallic shape would eventually be pulled from shallow water by a ranger who understands that parks hold secrets with the same stubbornness as alleys. There, the hands that touched that weapon would be traced, the path back to this living room reestablished bead by bead until the line was unbroken. What began on Norton Place as a whisper of fear on a neighbor's phone had become a case that demanded relentless clarity. 2 lives lost meant there could be no loose ends. The question now was not only who had done this, but how they had moved, what they had planned, and who had helped carry a plan from argument to gunshot to disposal. The scene had been read. The house had spoken. It was time to follow the story into the hours after the last shot and into the routes that would betray the men who believed distance could erase what they had done. In homicide work, the first 24 hours are critical. Every unanswered call, every mile driven, every word exchanged could be the thread that unravels the mystery. For Toledo detectives, the murder of a pregnant mother demanded an immediate and coordinated response. The investigation began with the obvious: who had access to her, who had reason to silence her, who stood to gain from her death. Detectives looked first at the people closest to Tameisha: family, friends, romantic ties. They mapped her circle of relationships, laying them out on a board in the squad room, each name linked with arrows that branched into possible motives. It didn't take long for one name to surface again and again: Paris James. He was more than an acquaintance. He was entangled with Tameisha in ways that carried both intimacy and conflict. Witness interviews hinted at arguments between them, conversations that grew tense whenever the pregnancy came up. Cell phone records quickly became the backbone of the case. Using digital warrants, investigators pulled location data from towers across Toledo. The pings formed a trail, showing James and his associate Jerry Scott moving through the city on the night of the murder. The timeline grew tighter as hours turned into minutes, then into seconds that placed them within reach of Norton Place at the time the shots were fired. Detectives didn't stop there. They expanded the search outward into the hours after the killing. Cell records showed a detour north, away from the home, through streets that led toward the Point Place neighborhood. It was not a casual drive. It was purposeful, directed. And then the signal stopped near the edge of a marshland preserve. Days later, A ranger with Metro Parks Toledo combed through the reeds and shallow water. The marsh was still, but hidden beneath the surface was a shape that didn't belong. Cold steel, coated with mud, the very weapon used to kill Tameisha in Malaysia. Forensic analysis confirmed the match. The gun tied the route of the suspects to the moment of the crime. Still, the motive remained less clear. Prosecutors began to build theories. Some believed James orchestrated the killing out of fear and doubt. Doubt about paternity, fear of responsibility, and pressure he had voiced in private messages. Others suggested darker reasoning, a desire to control the narrative of his life, even if it meant erasing another's. For Jerry Scott, the theory was simpler: loyalty. He was the accomplice, the man who stood alongside his friend in a plan that required silence and blood. Investigators pieced together contradictions in James's own words. To some, he spoke of support, of preparing to welcome the child. To others, he hinted at uncertainty, voicing thoughts of abortion long past the point where it was possible. This duplicity became a window into his state of mind. A man torn between appearing committed and plotting an escape from consequences he did not want to face. Theories spread like branches. Could the killing have been a robbery staged to mask the truth? Evidence suggested otherwise. Valuables remained untouched. The focus was clearly Tameisha herself. Was it revenge, jealousy, or retaliation for secrets we may never know? In the end, detectives returned to what was undeniable: the cell phone maps, the recovered weapon, and the testimony of those who had witnessed the strain in their relationship. The picture was becoming clearer. But for a family still grieving, clarity did not bring comfort. It only brought the harsh confirmation that the danger to Tameisha had not come from strangers in the night. It had come from men she knew, men she had let into her life, and one who had shared in the creation of the very child she carried. The investigation had delivered evidence. The question that remained was whether the justice system could deliver accountability. The courtroom grew heavier as the family's words were read aloud. Each sentence carried the weight of dreams that would never take shape. Tameisha's mother described how her granddaughter Malaysia was already part of the family's rhythm, how her kicks inside the womb were reminders of a spirit ready to burst into the world. She wrote about preparing for Girl Scouts, about laughter during sleepovers, about family vacations where her daughter would have carried her baby girl through airport terminals, smiling as strangers cooed at the newborn in her arms. But those memories exist only in imagination now. Instead of planning for a birth, the family planned a burial. Instead of holding a baby, her brothers now hold photographs. Her parents told the court that every morning begins with silence, a silence pierced only by the sound of children asking why their mother isn't home. Her father, usually a man of few words, admitted that he wakes at night convinced he hears her voice, only to remember the truth. He said, "We will spend the rest of our lives trying to rebuild her boys because they saw things no child should ever have to carry." At community vigils, the grief was shared beyond bloodlines. Neighbors lit candles on street corners, their flames flickering in the wind as prayers rose into the cold sky. Photographs of Tameisha and her unborn daughter were placed on tables surrounded by flowers and stuffed animals. Strangers who had never met her cried alongside relatives, the collective ache of Toledo visible in bowed heads and clasped hands. The community's mourning soon turned into resolve. Activists organized marches demanding safer neighborhoods and stronger protections for women facing threats from intimate partners. Churches opened their doors for healing services, their pews filled with faces streaked with tears. Friends of the family spoke directly to cameras, urging anyone with information to come forward, reminding viewers that silence was a choice. And silence only protected the guilty. Law enforcement echoed the plea. Crime Stoppers ran segments, displaying numbers at the bottom of television screens, repeating that no detail was too small to matter. In a case like this, the community's eyes and ears were as critical as any forensic test. Months stretched on, and while justice began to take form through courtrooms and sentences, the sense of loss did not fade. 2 men were convicted, but closure remained elusive. The shadow of betrayal, that the violence had come not from strangers, but from those connected to her, left scars deeper than prison terms could erase. And yet, the story of Tameisha Price and her daughter Malaysia is more than a headline or a verdict. It is a reflection of how fragile safety can be, even within the walls of one's own home. It is a reminder that behind statistics and crime reports are human lives, filled with laughter, struggle, hope, and love. As we reflect on her story, we must hold close the image of a mother who refused to give up on her child, who prepared for life even as danger closed in around her. We must honor the memory of Malaysia, a life silenced before it began, but not forgotten. The responsibility now rests on us to remember, to speak, to act. For every family raising children in uncertain neighborhoods, for every woman who feels unsafe when her voice is ignored, for every child robbed of a parent, silence cannot be an option. For Tameisha, for Malaysia, for her sons who will grow up with memories instead of their mother's touch, for her parents who will never stop carrying her name in their prayers. Justice came in the form of sentences and life terms, but true justice demands more. It demands awareness. It demands change. And it demands that we never let their story fade into statistics. If you're watching this, do not look away. Share her story. Keep her name alive. And remember that sometimes the most powerful act of justice is to ensure that no one else suffers in silence. This was the life and the loss of Tameisha Price and her unborn daughter Malaysia Price. The trial revealed everything. Jurors studied the digital trail, the weapon pulled from the marsh, the messages that exposed pressure and denial. Their verdict was unanimous. Guilty of aggravated murder, guilty of every charge that mattered. At sentencing, the defense asked for leniency. Judge Eric Marks looked directly at the men before him and said, "This is the worst form of violence that could have possibly occurred." Then he ordered 2 consecutive life terms without parole, sealing their fates. Yet for her family, justice was not enough. 2 boys grow up without their mother. A daughter, Malaysia, will never take her first breath. The ache remains, even as the city tries to carry them with prayer, with love, with remembrance. And that remembrance must not fade. Tameisha's story is a warning, but also a call to speak up when silence is dangerous, to protect mothers and children, to make sure names like hers are never erased. For Tameisha, for Malaysia, for every family shattered by hidden violence. If the story moved you, share it so others will remember her too. Subscribe for more true stories that deserve to be told. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because together, we keep their memory alive.